All right, guys, thank you so much for returning to our second installment of RTI in Action. This one is all about effective interventions. We've got Judy and Melissa here who are going to walk us through. If you guys have any questions or comments during the presentation, you know where the chat box is. Judy and Melissa, take it away.
Thanks, Michael. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the RTI in Action web series. I am Judy Teven, and with me is Melissa Sinanu. So last week focused on screening and progress monitoring. And this week, we're going to dive into the heart of any good RTI process, and that is effective interventions. Now, before we do get started, I want you to know that we will be recording this and sending it out to everyone who registered. And if you do have questions during the webinar, please go ahead and put those in chat. Our team is there ready to field them. And of course, then we will also have a Q&A at the end of our session.
So as Judy mentioned, this is week 2 of the 5-part series. Next week, we will talk about data meetings. Then in week 4, we will be looking at social and emotional learning and the sustainability of your practices. And finally, in week 5, we will talk to RTI practitioners about what's working for them. So at this point in your process, you've selected an awesome screener. You have reviewed the data and placed students that need extra support into their appropriate tiers. You may have even established the progress monitoring you're going to conduct each week to make sure students are responding to their interventions. Now the big question is, what exactly is the right intervention and how to implement it effectively? In today's webinar, we will go over the following aspects of interventions for excellent RTI MTSS processes. We will discuss the 2 most commonly accepted types of interventions, the difference between intervention and remediation, selecting a research-based solution, effectively differentiating your interventions between Tier 2 and Tier 3, strategies for building interventions into the school day, and finally, the reporting and data that help ensure success. So first, we will discuss the 2 most commonly recognized intervention models. The 2 most commonly recognized models for RTI interventions are called standard protocol and problem solving. And both of these are different than the approach the core curriculum takes. Let's take a second to talk about that because it is something we always get asked about when working with districts. Why do RTI MTSS practices recommend a different approach for mastering a skill in interventions than the approach that Tier 1 takes for learning? Studies show over and over again that interventions must be different from the core curriculum or remediation. Truly effective interventions should target weak areas and approach the skill using a different methodology than the core curriculum. So let's think about this in practical terms. I'm a 4th grader who did not master some key skills when I was a 3rd grader. It's frustrating to have those same skills presented to me to learn them the exact same way I struggled to learn them last year. A good intervention recognizes this and gives students at least one, ideally multiple approaches to learning this skill to prepare me for success as a 4th grader. Okay, now back to the 2 most commonly recognized models for interventions.
That's right. The first is the standard protocol model. A standard protocol model involves a research-validated intervention for a specific amount of time, duration, and frequency with small groups of students having similar needs. Now, a primary feature of the standard protocol model involves standardized instruction or intervention. Intervention groups are formed by identifying the general nature of a deficit and matching it to a prescribed treatment or protocol. An example of this might be SRA connecting math interventions. So this is a scripted intervention where teachers follow very rigid guidelines as they deliver the intervention in a small group setting. Now, this model is specific as to who provides the instruction and the frequency and the duration of the intervention and the materials being used. This standardized scripted intervention protocol is applied consistently to all students in that small group. Now, because the procedures within a standard protocol model are very clear and specific, treatment fidelity is relatively easy to check. Now, while it's easy to track fidelity, The other side of the coin is that often it is difficult to implement effectively unless you know that every student in Tier 2 has a similar deficit and will benefit from that same scripted small group lesson.
That's right. And then the problem-solving model takes an entirely different approach. In contrast, this model includes an in-depth analysis of skill deficits that comprise a student's performance level. This might be a combination of grades, high-stakes tests, and screener data that show specific skill deficits. Then from this, targeted interventions are created that are specific to each student. So common to RTI problem-solving models is a three-step process. Conceptualizing the problem. Is there a problem? What is it? Delivering targeted or individualized interventions. So what are we going to do about it? And finally, evaluating the effectiveness of the intervention. Did the intervention work? So a key strength of the problem-solving model is that individualization. But as you can imagine, the time it takes to implement is not always practical.
So really, this chart tells it all. The strength of the standard protocol model is that it includes those predefined research and is ready to implement right off the shelf. Now, the downside of this model is that it's too broad and often doesn't help every single student. Now, the strength of the problem-solving model is that it really works. Now, the downside is, as I'm sure everyone on this webinar knows, is that it can be super labor intensive to individualize instruction for every student. So many districts currently opt for a technology solution like Classworks that automatically blends these two models together. This creates an ideal learning environment for all students. A blended model specifically accounts for students in all tiers and all grades. Classworks combines the most effective aspects of each of these models, right? Leveraging technology to minimize teacher time needed for individualization. And of course, having the screener and progress monitoring aspects of RTI in the same platform lifts a huge burden for teachers too.
So now that you have a little background about the two most commonly accepted models, let's talk for a moment about intervention versus remediation. Then we will discuss selecting the program that's right for you. So these words are often used interchangeably, but it's really important for your RTI MTSS process to make a clear distinction. Remediation happens in Tier 1 and supports students learning the skills currently being taught in the classroom. Remediation is where a differentiated lesson may come into play. And of course, by differentiated lesson, we mean a lesson that teaches the same concept being currently taught in the classroom, but perhaps broken down more clearly into more concrete steps for mastery. You may be remediating, for example, during your office hours. Intervention is a whole different animal. This is when the student is receiving support to learn skills 1 or even multiple years below grade level. This becomes especially obvious at that all-important jump from elementary to middle school or junior high. A secondary certified teacher doesn't have the resources or really the capacity to teach a student elementary skills that weren't part of their certification. This is why a good intervention will identify the skills for students and then actually assign those skills automatically. So this changes the teacher's role into a coach and mentor on these intervention skills, essentially automating the problem-solving model for all teachers. So now let's think about the qualities to look for when selecting your intervention program.
Yep, selecting the right intervention includes many factors, really, right? You want a program that's easy for teachers to implement and engaging for students. It should address multiple areas of intervention and offer a wide array of grade level skills, really regardless of the assigned grade of the student. Now at Classworks, we believe that the right combination of automation and teacher flexibility is key also. Now, however, overriding all of this is selecting an evidence-based program that is proven to be effective. This can feel overwhelming as every vendor has some sort of study, right, that does show that they work. We want to go over some guiding suggestions when looking at a company's research. So look at the company's commitment to ongoing research. Make sure the product you're investing in is continually adding new studies to their portfolio. They should have an efficacy page on their website that's updated regularly. Next, look to make sure efficacy studies encompass the entire product offering, which means multiple grades and subjects, not just a few grades. And ideally, the studies will use a variety of measures to validate their analyses, right? So for example, at Classworks, we have an efficacy study not only showing the program closes gaps with our own universal screener as a measure, but also show growth within NWEA MAP and Renaissance STAR as the measure. So the treatment, AKA the intervention, and the measure, which is the test, are not always published by that same provider.
That's right, Judy. Examining the efficacy behind instructional technologies is crucial. You want to know that what you're implementing will genuinely help students succeed. So when evaluating research, remember to look at the design of the study in addition to the results. We do have a short video that I think we can link in the chat. It breaks down the components of a high-quality efficacy study, but we don't have time to go into that in our short time, obviously, here today. So we can send that, I think, as part of the recording. So again, look for that portfolio of research that shows a continuous approach and efficacy that captures different elements of whether and how a product is working. Really taking this approach is what allows us here at Classworks to confidently say that Classworks works. So now let's talk about what might change with the interventions between Tier 2 and Tier 3.
Yeah, there is a lot of general conversation about changing interventions between Tiers 2 and 3. So let's take a few minutes to think about this in practical terms. In a school day, the difference between a student in Tier 2 and 3 is the time that they're spending receiving intervention services, right? As you'd expect, the student in Tier 3 has a more intensive intervention than the student receiving Tier 2 services. So there are three main ways that we think of that this can be accomplished. The first is the frequency of the intervention. For example, by increasing the number of weekly intervention meetings from, say, 2 sessions to 4 sessions. Another is the length of the instructional sessions themselves. So, for example, by increasing the length from 30 minutes per session to 45 minutes per session. And the third is the duration of the intervention. For example, by increasing the number of weeks of the intervention, thinking like lasting from 10 weeks to 20 weeks.
And the interventions themselves between Tier 2 and 3 should look a little different as well. There are a few different approaches schools take. So some districts actually elect to use the standard protocol method for students in Tier 2, and then augment the problem-solving model, utilize the problem-solving model when students are in Tier 3. So 2 completely different interventions for the groups. So the standard protocol method would be scripted, small group instruction based on those common areas of weakness for students in Tier 2. Then the problem-solving model for Tier 3 students is individualized instruction designed specifically for that student. So in other districts, the approach is similar, but it's all using the problem-solving approach. A Tier 3 student participates in the Tier 2 intervention with their peers also receiving Tier 2 services. Then their additional time for Tier 3 may be some customized lessons for them to work on. So in Classworks, this might mean they're working on their individualized learning progression during extra learning time with the rest of the class. Then, during the time allocated for Tier 3 services, they may be working on a custom set of activities created by a teacher specifically based on what she thinks a student would benefit most from working on. For example, a custom Classworks assignment with lessons that teach compare and contrast between texts.
Yep, and another option for a Tier 3 student is simply to spend additional time in their individualized learning progression during the time that they're receiving these services. You could actually use your progress monitoring data to decide which option is best. If a student is meeting their rate of improvement target successfully, but they really have multiple years to catch up, you may want to use option 3 and simply allow them the extra time to catch up. Naturally, it's important that the student and the teacher stay in close communication, right, in all of these options as they work through their learning plans.
So now if the progress monitoring data, remembering that 4-point rule from last week, suggests modifying the intervention, you may want to think about custom assignments instead of spending all their intervention time working through a learning progression. And there's even an option 4 here, although it's not nearly as common as the other 3. If a student is not responding to their intervention, you may decide to replace the time they are spending in their learning progression with customized lessons based on the skills you have determined are necessary. So in Classworks, our custom instruction is perfect for this and saves teachers time actually building the lessons. But all of this is about the teacher knowing her students, monitoring data, doing check-ins, and generally using all of the information at her fingertips about the student to determine their solution. So next we will talk about strategies for making sure we have the time for students to receive these great intervention services.
So an intervention is only as good as the time that students can dedicate to it, right? Just like buying a stationary bike, right? Unfortunately, buying an exercise bike, but not carving out the time to use it 4 times a week doesn't help improve our fitness levels. So one thing that we've seen this year, really more than any other year, is schools building in extra learning time into their daily schedules. This dedicated time is separate from even reading blocks or centers. So recognizing that every student can benefit from an instructional time dedicated to exactly what they need to work on is really a very powerful change that can have a huge impact on students' response to their interventions. We are big advocates of having an entire class period built into the day, into that master schedule that gives students the time that they need to work on lessons that are just right for them.
Yep, and when you use a program like Classworks and a lot of technology programs, this works for all students, not only those in Tier 2 or Tier 3. Because we use assessment data to place every student along a progression, everyone is getting lessons that are exactly where they are ready to learn. So this includes your high flyers as well as those who need to catch up. But let's take a moment to think about what a dedicated extra learning block can mean for students receiving Tier 2 or 3 interventions. At Classworks, we suggest you set aside 45 minutes a day to work inside our application. So in classroom reality minutes, this will equal about 30 minutes inside the app, right? So again, we're assuming that we've set aside 45 minutes, but the available time to work in the application is closer to 30. So for example, on Monday, a student may take their reading and their math progress monitoring. Tuesday, they might create or reflect on their SMART goal before spending some time learning in their progression. Then Wednesday and Thursday can be dedicated to working inside their progression, and it might include a check-in on their goal as well. Then Friday might be a project or a goal tracker check-in, or working on reassigned skills to improve their mastery percentage. And of course, throughout the week, they talk with their teacher about their progress. Now, this schedule does include some SEL components of an RTI MTSS process. I know we haven't covered that yet in this web series, but that is where the SMART goal setting for students will be discussed. So building the time for students to receive intervention services has always been a challenge in the school day, as Judy said. But I really do think we're finally turning the corner on that as we see more and more districts build this much needed extra learning time into every school day.
Yeah, and finally, a good intervention program, like everything else related to a strong RTI MTSS process, offers easy access to this excellent data, right? So when selecting a program, review the data all stakeholders will be looking at. First, let's talk about daily data. Is there a dashboard that allows the teacher to easily review and modify the intervention? Teachers need an easy way to monitor and take action on student data. Is there a place to have conversations with the student about their progress? Student and teacher communication is key to academic intervention success. And what about weekly or monthly reports for student support meetings? Are both the progress monitoring reports and the instructional intervention reports easy to access, and meaningful for all stakeholders. So for example, the Classwork Standards Mastery Report not only shows you all the important skills the student completed, how long they spent on it, and their score, it also connects that skill back to your state standards. And is the data available to be sliced and diced multiple ways? If you're focused on a specific domain or a strand for student intervention, that may be the only data you want to keep in their folders, right? To document their progress. It's important to be able to pull out just that specific data. And what about larger visualizations for district decision makers, right? An easy way to review the health and wellness of your interventions for students is really, really important. So for example, Classworks has partnered with Amazon to bring you insights in the platform. This detailed reporting shows you if the students you expect to be receiving intervention services are receiving them, right? And if those students are being monitored to achieve the expected levels of mastery, and even which domains they are focusing on. This makes it really easy to make those minor adjustments that ensure student growth and response to their interventions really before it's too late. All of this data can be filtered by demographics as well, allowing you to compare subpopulations to make sure that everyone is growing. These three aspects of data and reporting combined ensure that you have everything you need to effectively monitor and document the success of the interventions that students are completing. Because ultimately, a good RTI program is showing results for students, and that's where a good intervention really shines.
That's right, Judy. An intervention is ultimately what supports student success, and it's at the heart of a good RTI process. So thanks again for joining us for the second installment of our RTI in Action webinar series. This was a week 2 session focused on interventions. So today we reviewed the 2 commonly accepted types of interventions. Again, the difference between intervention and remediation, selecting the solution that's right for you, how to effectively differentiate your interventions between Tier 2 and Tier 3, some strategies for building interventions into the school day, and finally, the reporting and data that help ensure success.
And as we mentioned at the beginning of today's webinar, next week is going to be about data and decision making, focusing on key actions and takeaways for your data meetings. And week 4 is the integration of social and emotional learning and building a sustainable RTI process for all stakeholders. And finally, in week 5, we're really excited to talk to practitioners and get some great information about what's working for them. So we really appreciate you guys being with us today. And I do think I saw some questions coming into the chat. So we'll take some time to talk through those and any others that you guys want to speak up and throw out.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Melissa. That was an amazing session. Again, guys, you do not want to miss next week all about data and decision making. We've got a couple of really good questions that have come in, but to kick us off, let's look to Trish Bodine, who asks, does Classworks cover behavioral interventions?
So Classworks works with districts on behavioral interventions a couple different ways. We do integrate a positive behavioral intervention report card, daily report card that's digital. So the teacher writes in there per class period, the student can see it, the parents can see it. So that's all in there. But Classworks also incorporates goal setting for students using that SMART goal. And that's really where a student will set their behavioral goals in there. So that's kind of how we support that. And
I believe our SEL session will go into that a little bit, right, Melissa?
For sure, definitely.
Yep. So definitely register for that one too, Trish, if that's of interest to you. The next question that we have, can you give me examples of where to fit in extra learning time? That's a good one.
That is, and that it's so important. The hardest part of extra learning time is actually finding a place in the schedule for it, right? So we've seen a lot of creativity with this. Honestly, most often it's in the morning, first thing in the morning. It can be breakfast clubs, but it could just be that first 30 minutes of the day. That is typically where we see it being fit in. But we've also seen schools just take it by grade level and fit it into the most appropriate time for a specific grade level and things like that. Lots of different creative ideas with that, but the scheduling is the most important piece to this.
My teachers hold office hours every day. Does that suffice for intervention time?
Oh, that's a great one. So, and we kind of touched on this a little bit in the webinar itself, but we think about office hours as being remediation. So, and I know when I was teaching, we called it a parking lot, things like that. Anytime it really is reflecting back on what you're teaching in class, we think about that as remediating your tier 1 core instruction. So when you're thinking about carving the time for intervention, it does need to be a very dedicated amount of time for students to just work on closing those gaps, right? And being able to really look at it from that perspective, but also allowing that time that includes testing for probes and everything that needs to be done to monitor that intervention as well, not just kind of an one-off which is often what office hours becomes.
Right. So important. This next one is really good as well. So we want an intervention program that does not overwhelm our teachers. How do we make sure to pick something that is easy for them?
So that is a great question. And I think the best way you can do that is you sit down with your vendor and you say, show me the steps my teachers are going to take, from screening to progress monitoring to the reports they're running for data meetings to how they're modifying interventions, and have them step you through the teacher's expectations and really understand how that's going to work for the teacher. I mean, that's one of the things, especially when we talk about sustainable practices, I think in 2 weeks, the more you can have something under one roof, the more it can be streamlined for teachers, the more it can integrate. That's how you're going to know that you're picking the exact right program for your teachers, is that they find it easy to use and that you get visibility into that. Something that I don't think a sample login or even a presentation is going to show you unless you actually ask that question when you're in the presentation, have them step you through that.
Excellent. And then our next question is, I find efficacy a very difficult thing to evaluate. What can I look out for? What are some easy things to look out for?
This is super hard, right? I mean, we're not psychometricians, right? So I would ask to see their efficacy page. I'd make sure they're updating it regularly. Again, I'd make sure the studies reflect the product as it is today, right? Not the product as it was 10 years ago, perhaps. I'd also make sure, hey, I'm intervening. I'm doing a K-8 intervention. I want to make sure that your study isn't just K-1, right? I want to know that you've got studies that show that you work with all grades and all the subjects that I'm trying to get this on. And just look for some of those key pieces. Look if something's peer reviewed, for example. Those kind of things can really give you the information you need without having to dive too deep or really become an expert in data analysis.
Right. And those are all of the questions that I had that came through my end. We can give it a couple of minutes to see if anything else comes through. But in the meantime, I have seen a couple of people asking where to find recordings. They will be emailed out to you. Tomorrow, you will receive this recording as well as the previous week. And then we are posting these on our RTI in Action webpage on classworks.com. So definitely use that as your resource. You guys have been a fantastic audience. Please drop any lingering questions you might have in the chat box. If you would like to learn more about Classworks and are not part of the Classworks family already, definitely start a conversation with us at classworks.com. We'd be happy to take a look at what's going on with RTI in your district. All right, if there are no more questions coming in, we will see you guys hopefully next week for our next session on data and decision making.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Take care.